At night, in the capital's neighborhoods, denunciations are best heard through thin walls. A cold wind blows from the Sea of Marmara over sleeping Constantinople. Guards beat their spears against stones to stay awake. And in one of the houses in the official district, by the dim light of a lamp, a Tabellion quietly rereads someone else's life. On the table in front of him lies a wax tablet on which accusations against an adult woman, the wife of a court dignitary, have been carefully written. The denunciation states that her behavior is indecent, that strange men appear in the house, and that she has been seen without the required veil. At the bottom is the name of the icon painter, who recently lost a dispute over payment for work in the same house. The smell of wax and rancid oil hangs in the air, and at this moment, not only a moral complaint is born, but also a legal case in which the woman's body will be covered by the paragraphs of a marriage contract and articles of the Imperial Code of Laws. Greetings to everyone listening to this analysis. Write in the comments which city and country you are watching this video from, and what you have heard about the licentiousness of the Byzantine court and the alleged complete defenselessness of women against rumors. I wish you a calm but attentive listening experience, because next we will talk about how, in an empire where people could be blinded for rebellion and have their noses cut off for conspiracy, the marriage contract became a shield and the ekloga separated flesh and law, preventing denunciation from completely destroying the life of an adult woman. To understand this, one must move beyond the myth of the Byzantine palace as a continuous masquerade, where everyone sleeps with everyone else and intrigues are resolved in whispers in the corridors. The real Constantinople of Emperor Leo III and his successors was not just a palace and ceremonies. It was a dense city of crowded houses, craft workshops, monasteries, shops, and barracks. In the mornings, adult craftsmen, porters, merchants, officials, and peasants who had come from the surrounding lands jostled in the narrow streets. Icons and frescoes hang along the walls, many of which will soon fall victim to iconoclastic policies. In the evenings, behind closed doors in those same houses, it is not the Holy Fathers who are read aloud, but marriage contracts, dowry inventories, and wills. The life of the empire is built on paper and wax, no less than on prayers. In the 8th century, after the long shadow of Justinian, imperial law began to change form. The codification known as the ekloga was created on the initiative of Emperor Leo III Isaur and his son Constantine to adapt the old body of laws to the new political and religious reality. Officially, it was described as a selection of the best laws, an attempt to make the law more humane and more in line with Christian teaching. In practice, this meant that some crimes were no longer punishable by death, but systematic mutilation appeared, cutting off noses and hands, burning marks on faces. The same pages include rules on marriage, divorce, dowry, and slander. Where myth depicts a dissolute court, the documents show meticulous concern for who owes whom and how much if family life falls apart. Marriage in such an empire was not only a sacrament sanctified by liturgy, but also a strict civil contract. For the urban classes, a union without notarization was considered incomplete. Before the wedding, the families agree on the dowry, how much money, fabrics, jewelry, and property the wife brings, what part of the property the husband undertakes to allocate, what will happen to this property in the event of divorce or death of one of the spouses. All this is recorded in a document that is kept not only at home, but also with a notary or in the city archives. Thus, a woman's body, her reputation, and her future are tied to lines of text, the signatures of witnesses, and the seal of a little man whose name no one will remember. The Ecloga intervenes in this system, specifying which grounds for divorce are considered acceptable and which are not. It lists cases of adultery, violence, attempted murder, prolonged abandonment of the family, and serious illness. For each of these points, the consequences are specified. Who loses the right to a dowry, who is obliged to provide for the former partner, and to whom the children and property are transferred. It is important that in this set of laws, women do not disappear behind their husbands. In some cases, they are explicitly granted the right to divorce and retain their property if their husband is guilty of a serious violation of marital obligations. For an era where physical violence remains an everyday reality, this is not a gesture of mercy, but an attempt to stabilize society through predictable rules. Against the backdrop of these dry lines, denunciations appear, similar to the one lying on the table of the Tabellion in our episode. An icon painter who worked in the house of a dignitary recently lost a dispute over payment. In the context of iconoclasm, his position is already unstable. Some orders are disappearing, old icons are being destroyed or covered up, and monastery workshops are losing their status. He claims in his complaint that the official's wife is behaving indecently, that people from his circle are allegedly visiting her, and that she is violating propriety. He hopes that the accusation will damage the family's reputation and force her husband to reconsider the property dispute. In a world where a woman's honor is linked to her ability to preserve her dowry and the status of her home, such a complaint turns rumors into a potential legal tool. But in Byzantine reality, rumor alone is not enough. The imperial machine is accustomed to formalizing even moral accusations through paperwork. For a complaint to become a case, it must be submitted to the appropriate office, registered, and sometimes a fee must be paid. Witnesses appear who confirm or refute what they have heard under oath. The judge, often a secular official with a legal education, compares the narrative with the letter of the eclogues. If the case involves adultery, he looks for the relevant article, checks whether the signs of a crime are described there, whether direct evidence is needed, and whether there are grounds for depriving the woman of her dowry. Thus, a physical accusation, a hint of indecency, is met with a cold procedure. This does not negate the cruelty. The same eclogue prescribes punishments for adultery, where instead of the death penalty, there are bodily injuries, exile, and deprivation of property. The measures may differ for different sexes, and the body, as the bearer of shame, remains the central object of punishment. But alongside these articles, there are also provisions on slander. False denunciation, especially if it concerns morality and can destroy someone else's home, is considered a serious crime. The guilty party faces not only a fine, but also corporal punishment and the imposition of a mark of shame. The law recognizes that the words contained in a denunciation can hurt as badly as a knife, and attempts to provide minimal protection where rumors can easily be turned into weapons. In practice, everything depends on the social weight of the parties involved. The official, the husband of the accused woman, is not a poor man. He is connected with the palace administration, possibly involved in tax collection or army supplies, working with appropriations and state warehouses. He has access to imperial lawyers, acquaintances in the chancelleries, and relatives among the clergy. The icon painter is much more vulnerable. His workshop depends on orders, on the whims of customers, and on the course of imperial religious policy. That is why it seems advantageous to him to strike where the state promises to be strict, on the indecent behavior of women. He bets on shame and moral fear, on the fact that the dignitary's family will prefer to pay and hush up the matter rather than deal with it publicly. However, the eclogue is not only a code of punitive morality, but also a bureaucratic filter. The icon painter's complaint does not appear in a vacuum, but alongside the couple's marriage contract. The contract lists the sums brought by the wife, the property that the husband undertook to allocate, and the conditions under which the dowry is returned to her relative's home. It also lists witnesses, who may include people from the same official's circle. This document is not kept in a box by an exhausted woman, but in the hands of a notary and in the city office. When the case comes to the judge, he has to take into account not only rumors, but also the existing contract. Here, the myth of a court of complete debauchery begins to crack. In popular imagination, the Byzantine court is an endless series of love affairs, poison in goblets, and secret liaisons in the corridors of the palace. Chronicles written by detractors of the empire eagerly emphasize the dirtiest stories, turning individual rulers and their spouses into symbols of decay. But alongside these texts, there are statutes, codes of law, marriage contracts, and court decisions, where the same court appears as a machine, primarily concerned with the distribution of land, money, and positions. In such documents, female honor appears not only as a reason for preaching, but also as a legal category related to dowries, inheritance, and the possibility of entering into new unions. The icon painter, in our episode, may not read the eclogue himself, but he lives in the world it has shaped. He understands that an accusation of indecency can officially become a reason for divorce, depriving a woman of her dowry and striking a blow to her relatives. He hopes to use the fear of this scenario to his advantage. But by the time the denunciation lands on the judge's desk, the case is no longer his to decide. The imperial bureaucracy begins to compare his words with the letter of the law and the terms of the contract. The judge asks not only about the woman's behavior, but also whether there are other disputes between the parties, whether the denunciation is related to money and unpaid remuneration. Step by step, a tense conflict develops in which physical accusations clash with the text. In the next movement of the story, it will become clear that behind the mask of concern for morality lies a property dispute, and in the shadow of icons and parades sits codified law, which is sometimes capable of pushing away a woman's hand raised under the pretext of caring for her purity. For now, it is important to see the initial elements: the city, where denunciations are turned into wax tablets; the imperial code Ecloga, where articles on adultery and slander stand side by side; the marriage contract, which unexpectedly turns out to be the center of gravity of the whole case. This combination of the myth of debauchery and the contract document will become the field on which the fate of the dignitary's wife and her dowry will be decided. Then the denunciation begins to take on a life of its own. What the icon painter whispered to his apprentices turns into a line in the register. A complaint about the indecent behavior of the official's wife arrives at the office, is copied onto parchment, and entered into the books. Meanwhile, the dignitary's house is searched for chests and bundles of documents. The marriage contract, the inventory of the dowry, and old receipts are taken out. The woman's relatives look not at rumors, but at the wording. Under what conditions she can lose her property? What grounds for divorce are recognized? What exactly is considered proven adultery? And what is just slander? The courtroom where the case is heard looks more like a warehouse of human biographies than a ceremonial hall. On the tables of the judge and clerks lie collections of sample lawsuits, notebooks with formulas, and compendiums of laws, including the Eclogue. It already states that marriage is a legal fact, not just a sacrament, that there is a list of acceptable grounds for divorce and clear consequences: who loses their dowry, who is obliged to support their former spouse, who is responsible for the property. There are also articles on slander, which is especially dangerous when it destroys a home and takes away a woman's economic shield. The icon painter, in filing his complaint, attempts to use moral language as a tool of pressure. He describes meetings, hints at visits by outside men, and emphasizes that he has seen the mistress in situations that society considers suspicious. Behind this lies not a concern for moral purity, but a very specific defeat: a dispute over payment for work, a lost order, the fear of being left without money in unstable times. In a situation where the iconoclastic policy had already undermined some of his orders, he perceives the dignitary's house as a source of funds and tries to strike at the most vulnerable spot, the wife's reputation. But for the judge, it is not only the emotional background that is important, but also the source of profit. In Byzantine practice, the price of denunciations is well known. The empire is accustomed to complaints about heresy and conspiracies, which are most often motivated by property interests. Therefore, the icon painter's claims are checked for links to money. It turns out that shortly before the denunciation, he had already argued with this house over payment, and that the refusal to comply with his demands preceded a sudden concern for morality. The marriage contract presented by the woman's family shows that deprivation of the dowry is possible only in the case of a clearly proven serious violation, and not on the basis of a single hostile testimony. The witnesses brought by the icon painter are no longer questioned as casual listeners, but as participants in the proceedings. Some honestly admit that they only knew the retelling of his complaints, while others refer to general conversations in the neighborhood. There are few or no direct observations of what could be classified as adultery within the meaning of the article. This is recorded in the minutes. The denunciation, intended as a blow, begins to look like an attempt to manipulate the court. From this point on, another part of the eclogue comes into play: the norms of slander and false accusation, especially if it is aimed at destroying the marriage contract and seizing property. At the same time, the threat to the woman does not disappear. Even if the court does not deprive her of her dowry, the very fact of the investigation leaves a mark. In the close-knit Byzantine society, any entry in the court record may later resurface in another dispute or intrigue. Her name is now linked in the archives to a case of indecency, and this creates a risk in the long term. That is why the family is so insistent on the contract and the letter of the law. Only public recognition of slander and confirmation of the preservation of the dowry gives her a chance to maintain her position. The confrontation between the icon painter and the official gradually reveals two different instruments of power. The craftsman relies on rumor, moral fear, and the vulnerability of a woman's reputation. The official relies on the code, the marriage contract, and a mechanism that was originally created as an instrument of imperial control, but in this particular situation functions as a means of protection. The eclogue, conceived as a selection of the best and most Christian norms, stands between them as a heavy text that prevents the female body from becoming a free target for the informer until the conditions of the procedure are fulfilled. At the end of this stage, it becomes clear that without the combination of the myth of debauchery at court versus the article on slander and contracts, the case would have long since ended in the destruction of the marriage and the loss of the dowry. Now the judge will have to decide how far he is willing to go in following the letter of the law against the custom of punishing on a single charge. The judge has to make a decision, not in a vacuum, but within a city that breathes suspicion. In the neighborhoods, people discuss not only grain prices and rumors of new campaigns, but also how the authorities' attitude toward images, marriage, and property disputes is changing. The iconoclastic policy of the emperors makes everyone who works with images vulnerable. Yesterday, an icon painter was considered a pious craftsman. Today, he can easily be called suspicious, too attached to material images, too connected to monastic circles. The official understands this and exploits it. Those around him begin to cautiously hint that the dissatisfied master is not only slandering him, but also living on the edge of what is permissible. Thus, the moral language with which the icon painter wanted to strike at the dignitary's house turns against him. At this time, the woman's family bets on maximum transparency. They do not hide her or remove her from public life. On the contrary, they demonstratively show that she observes rituals, attends services, and participates in the required receptions. This is not a gesture of trust, but a calculation. The fewer reasons for suspicion, the more difficult it will be for anyone to confirm the accusations. Meanwhile, her dowry remains secured in documents. Relatives continue to remind the court that deprivation of property is possible only in the case of a proven violation, and not in the case of general bad reputation. Feeling that the case is getting out of control, the icon painter tries to seek support from the clergy. He complains to the priests that, in his opinion, the official's household is living unchristian, recounting the laughter and conversations he allegedly overheard, which he considers unacceptable. In an atmosphere of religious tension, he hopes that there will be clergymen willing to use the case as an example of debauchery in the court, and to put pressure on the court through sermons and personal connections. But some of the clergy have already been burned by denunciations and understand how dangerous it is to tie their reputation to a case where the evidence is shaky. Some limit themselves to general moralizing from the pulpit, without naming names or putting the pressure on the icon painter that he had hoped for. Meanwhile, the judge is increasingly focusing on the financial side of the dispute. He calls witnesses to testify about the icon painter's payment, examines receipts and verbal agreements that were recorded at the time of hiring. It turns out that the master did indeed carry out the order in the dignitary's house, but part of the work was stopped due to a change in political line. Some images were considered too honorable for saints, too material, requiring correction or destruction. The official refused to pay the full amount for what could now become a source of theological problems. The dispute, which initially began as a conflict over money and the status of the images, was disguised as concern for the morality of the official's wife. This linking of moral denunciation to economic defeat is a key point. For a judge raised on the text of the eclogues and other legal compilations, it becomes obvious that he is dealing with a typical case of an attempt to use moral language as a club. He sees that the accusation did not arise on its own, and not at the moment of discovery of the alleged offense, but immediately after the failed negotiations on payment. This reminds him of other cases where accusations of heresy or treason suddenly appeared precisely where one side lost money or land. Imperial law, although it serves the authorities, still contains enough rules on abuse to give it support. Several levels are mixed in the reasoning behind the decision that is beginning to form in his mind. On the one hand, he is obliged to protect public morality and not give the impression that the rich and those close to the court can violate the rules with impunity. On the other hand, he understands that the destruction of a marriage contract on the basis of a single dubious denunciation will undermine the entire system. If women and their families see that any dowry can be taken away through a false complaint, they will become afraid to enter into unions with houses that are under close scrutiny, or they will look for ways to circumvent the law. This does not suit either the emperor or the administration, which relies on the stability of family units as the basis of its tax, military, and social structures. In the archives of the empire, one can find decisions where the courts directly pointed to the connection between slander and property interests. In such cases, the judges not only acquitted the accused, but also punished the informers with fines, mutilation, and exile. This did not eliminate the general climate of suspicion, but it did set precedents. The law recognizes that moral language can be an instrument of violence. In the case under consideration, this logic becomes a saving grace. The judge notes that there is no evidence of adultery in the sense of the articles of the eclogues, that the woman's behavior can be interpreted as careless or causing rumors, but not as a legal fact destroying the marriage. However, there is a clear line between refusal to pay and the appearance of a denunciation. This allows the full use of the rules on defamation. The icon painter is now seen not as a defender of morality, but as a person trying to achieve through the courts what he failed to achieve through negotiations. His attempt to hide behind religious rhetoric and general phrases about honor begins to look like an abuse of the court. For the Byzantine system, accustomed to political denunciations, this is nothing new. But applying the same logic to marital and property conflicts is a step that shows how deeply the law has penetrated private life. At the level of the big picture, this is a blow to the familiar myth. Outside observers, later chroniclers, and detractors of the empire like to describe it as a space of constant debauchery and courtly licentiousness, where people's bodies, especially women's, are used without any protection, and rumors decide everything. But court records and texts such as the eclogues show something else. Constant attempts to package even the dirtiest stories within a legal framework. Marriage is a contract. A dowry is a legally formalized resource, and slander is not just whispering, but a punishable offense. In our case, it is precisely this bureaucratic shell that allows us to begin to turn the situation around. The question is no longer whether the woman is pure, but who used her body as a pretext for a property attack, and why. Thus, another layer is added to the conflict between the icon painter and the official. the myth of palace debauchery versus the text of the contract and the law. In the next step, the court will not only formally recognize that there are no grounds for depriving the woman of her dowry, but will also decide how severely to punish slander. This will determine not only the fate of one craftsman, but also send a signal to the entire city. Will moral language remain a free club against those who have something to lose? Or will imperial law, represented by a cloga, still try to draw a line between rumor and legal fact? The answer to this question is not formed solely in the mind of one judge. It is weighed down by the walls of the city, steeped in the memory of other trials, other denunciations, other fates. Constantinople knows of cases where accusations of heresy or conspiracy began with a similar complaint recorded on wax. It knows how quickly the discontent of a craftsman or an offended subordinate turned into a formal reason for confiscating property. But in cases involving marriage and dowries, the stakes are particularly high. This is where the honor of the family, the economic foundation of the family, and the stability of the very apparatus that collects taxes and recruits people for war intersect. Before announcing his decision, the judge returns to the papers once more. He has brought additional information about the icon painter's past cases. It turns out that he has already had conflicts with customers, in one case ending in reconciliation, in another not reaching court. This does not automatically make him guilty, but it paints a picture of a man who is accustomed to using complaints as a tool of pressure. On the other hand, there were also complaints about the official. He was accused of excessive harshness in collecting taxes, of embezzling part of the proceeds, and of covering up for his subordinates. None of these cases led to serious penalties, but the fact itself shows that it is not abstract virtue and vice that stand before the court, but two very real participants in the system, each with their own history of abuse and compromise. The woman finds herself between them like a figure on a board, but tied to a document. Her biography in the case file is reduced to a few short lines: her origin, the size of her dowry, the date of her marriage, the names of the witnesses to the contract, and a brief description of her daily duties in the house. No feelings, no sympathy, no irritation, only functions and property. This dehumanization is frightening, but in this case, it turns out to be a form of protection. The law sees her as the subject of property rights, not just someone's wife. And this dry status, fixed in the contract, prevents the court from crushing her with a single stroke of the pen. Meanwhile, rumors surrounding the case persist. In the neighborhood where the icon painter lives, people talk about his courage and how he allegedly was not afraid to stand up against the brothel. The official's entourage whispers about the envy of the craftsman and how anyone can now try to pull at the hem of the authorities' robe. These conversations push both sides to make demonstrative gestures. The icon painter tries to show his piety, appears more often in church, emphasizes his attachment to the official line of iconoclasm or to its opponents, depending on which course is more profitable at the moment. The official pretends that the matter does not concern him, but at the same time strengthens his connections in the offices, reminding his colleagues how many responsibilities his house bears. When the day of the decision finally arrives, the courtroom is crowded. Not only the immediate participants are present, but also those who hope to see a precedent in this case. Craftsmen want to understand whether it is possible to use the language of morality in property disputes. Representatives of families whose daughters marry into the ruling and bureaucratic circles await an answer to the question of how secure their investments are. Several clergymen are present as observers. They are interested in how willing the secular authorities are to take moral considerations into account when it comes to contracts. The judge reads out the main part of the decision without dramatic effect, monotonously and dryly. The minutes record that the icon painter's accusations against the woman have not been sufficiently substantiated. It is noted that the witnesses presented referred mainly to conversations and rumors, rather than direct observation of facts falling under the articles of the Ecloga on adultery. It is emphasized that suspicious situations alone, interpreted by the prosecutor in his own way, are not sufficient to deprive the woman of her dowry and declare the marriage invalid. In a separate point, the court notes the connection between the denunciation and a property dispute. The document states that the complaint of indecency appeared shortly after the official's house refused to satisfy the craftsman's claims for payment for his work. This is interpreted as an attempt to use the court and moral language to achieve personal gain. On this basis, the norms of the Ecloga on slander and abuse of rights are applied to the case. The icon painter is fined and deprived of part of his civil honor. The decision may include a ban on conducting certain activities, a temporary restriction of rights, or threaten more severe corporal punishment if such an incident is repeated. The text does not dwell on details, but emphasizes that false accusations in matters of marriage and honor are a serious offense. The most important point is implied between the lines. The court confirms that the marriage contract remains in force and that the woman's dowry belongs to her and her family. This means that none of the terms of the contract are considered to have been violated. The official's house retains its structure, the union is considered valid, and the property is protected. In the eyes of those around them, this sounds like a signal. The bureaucratic armor of the contract has withstood the blow. In this logic, female honor turns out to be not an abstract virtue, but a legal category attached to a list of woven goods, jewelry, and sums of money. The reaction to this decision is ambiguous. For some artisans, it sounds like a defeat for the common man, an attempt by the authorities to protect their own. They see this case as further confirmation that the bureaucracy protects officials and their homes. But others hear something different. For the first time, slander, disguised as concern for morality, has been noticeably rebuffed. It becomes clear to them that, under certain conditions, the court can see the economic calculation behind a moral phrase and punish it. This does not make the imperial system fair, but it adds another level of caution for those who are accustomed to using gossip as a weapon. For the woman's family, the decision also does not mean complete victory. Yes, the dowry is preserved, the marriage is formally protected, but the shadow of the proceedings remains. Her name appears in the court book, next to a note about a case where the word indecency was used. Byzantine society does not forget such notes instantly. In the future, if the house gets into a new conflict, this case may be remembered again, as an argument, as a hint, as part of the established reputation. But still, the bureaucratic recording of slander as slander gives her a chance to continue living not as an outcast, but as the lawful wife of an official with inviolable property status. For the icon painter, the sentence is a blow not only to his wallet, but also to his social status. In an unstable economy, a fine can easily mean debt and the loss of his workshop. The restriction of his rights, or the very fact of his conviction for slander, makes him a less attractive partner for customers. He will begin to be treated as a person who is capable of involving his patrons in unpleasant lawsuits. In a city where reputation feeds as well as money, such a stain can be heavier than corporal punishment. In a broader political context, this case becomes a convenient example for imperial propaganda. Court circles and part of the clergy use it to assert that the law in the empire allegedly protects marriage and women, that false accusations do not go unpunished, and that the ecloga is not only a set of harsh penalties, but also an instrument of justice. At the same time, the fact that it was property interests and the existence of a contract that helped the woman survive the attack is downplayed in official accounts. The emphasis shifts to abstract orthodox morality and the image of righteous judgment, although in reality it was the cold text of the contract that proved to be her salvation. Step by step, the bureaucratic shield of the contract is formed, refuting the popular myth of the courtyard as a space of complete debauchery without rules. The example of this private, dirty, painful story shows that even where rumors about physical affairs spread from workshop to workshop, the final blow or defense comes not from the mouths of gossipers, but from the lines written by the hand of the Tebellion under the protection of imperial law. In the final movement of this story, it remains to be seen how the memory of this case will be reflected in city conversations, sermons, family strategies, and ideas about what actually protects the body and honor of an adult woman in an empire that is accustomed to preying, maiming, and codifying at the same time. The court's decision, which for those involved in the case was a matter of life, property, and livelihood, quickly becomes just another layer of noise for the city. A few weeks after the verdict, conversations in the neighborhoods shift to a new tax, rumors of a raid by neighbors, and the latest change in church policy. But the wording itself remains in the archives, and the logic of this decision slowly begins to seep into practice. The scribes who transcribe the minutes preserve phrases about the connection between denunciation and property disputes, about the insufficiency of rumors for depriving someone of their dowry, about the severity of slander in matrimonial cases. For them, this is not just text, but a model to which they can return when another craftsman or neighbor tries to attack the house through moral language. Among notaries and tabellions, this decision becomes a quiet source of support. They were already accustomed to viewing marriage as a contract, but now they have a document confirming that the court is capable of siding with the contract against denunciation. When drawing up new marriage certificates, some are beginning to spell out in more detail the clauses on the protection of dowries and on who can initiate a divorce and under what conditions. Additional clauses on the need for convincing evidence are creeping into the text. The wording remains dry, but behind it lies the fear of repeating the fate of a woman whose life was destroyed by a complaint of indecency. Craftsmen in workshops disagree. Some see what happened as a warning. Trying to resolve property disputes through moral denunciations is dangerous not only for the addressee, but also for the informer himself. Others continue to believe that the court simply sided with the powerful. They discuss how the icon painter miscalculated by not securing more serious support, not preparing the ground among priests or influential patrons. For them, the main lesson is not that slander is punishable, but that striking at an official's home requires different alliances. At this level, the case becomes part of an informal survival guide. How far can you go in fighting those who are above you? Among officials, history is used differently. It becomes an opportunity to remind their households once again of the importance of contracts and the need to immediately record any major agreements. When discussing what happened, men from this social stratum recall the articles of the eclogues, not about punishment for adultery, but about the rules of marriage and dowry. For them, the icon painter's work is confirmation that bureaucratic armor works if it is put on in time. A marriage contract, properly executed receipts, connections in the offices. The myth that everything in the empire is decided by rumors and whispers in the corridors gives way to a darker but more realistic picture. Decisions are made by paper, signatures, and access to those who can read that paper. In the church environment, the case gives rise to another layer of ambiguity. Some preachers use it as a story about the harm of gossip and the severity of slander. They tell their flock that an unjust denunciation can destroy not only the life of the accused, but also the soul of the informer himself, leading to fines, disgrace, and, in extreme cases, corporal punishment. At the same time, the extravagance and cruelty of the officials involved in the case remain behind the scenes. Others, on the contrary, perceive what happened as confirmation that secular authorities are too eager to protect their own homes and too reluctant to investigate moral accusations within their own circle. Both sides use the same story, adapting it to their own preconceived notions. In this sense, the myth of a dissolute court lives on, but it is contradicted by a document in which debauchery was never proven, while slander was named and punished. The woman's life after the trial does not turn into a peaceful existence behind high walls. She has to adapt to a new reality, where her name is forever associated with the case. At parties, receptions, and church visits, she continues to feel stares that mix curiosity and distrust. For some of those around her, the very fact that her honor was the subject of a court case is already a stain, even if the court found no evidence of a crime. But it is precisely the fact that she kept her dowry and that the marriage was recognized as valid that gives her the strength to continue playing her assigned role. She is still the mistress of an official's house, a woman with property and connections, not a figure thrown into poverty, living on the charity of a monastery. The icon painter who initiated the case gradually disappears into the city crowd. The fine and the loss of his rights make his position precarious. He may lose his workshop or be forced to downsize it and move to a less prestigious neighborhood. Some customers refuse his services, fearing that a man already marked in the court records as a slanderer will bring them more problems than benefits. For part of society, he becomes an example of how an attempt to strike at the powerful, under the guise of concern for morality, backfires on the informer himself. For others, he is yet another confirmation of the cruelty of a system that does not tolerate attempts to expose its dirty laundry. Meanwhile, in the offices of the empire, they continue to rewrite the Ecloga, adding new interpretations to it and linking it to other legal texts. The code, created under one emperor, outlives him, absorbs new realities, and is used both in times of relative stability and in times of crisis. In every generation, there are those who see it primarily as a tool for punishment and mutilation, and those who notice articles in it that protect marriage contracts, dowries, and the right to demand divorce in cases of extreme violations. The story of the official's house and the icon painter's complaint fits quietly into this long series, without loud chronicle lines, but its logic remains. Where rumors try to destroy a marriage, the law sometimes sides not with loud accusations, but with a dry contract. For a historian who, centuries or millennia later, opens an archive and finds such cases, this clash is particularly revealing. On one side are later accounts of the Byzantine court as a place of constant debauchery, where women were allegedly deprived of any protection, and their bodies were merely decorations for banquets and palace corridors. On the other, there are court decisions, where the same women appear as holders of property rights, as participants in contracts, as subjects on whose status alliances between families and the stability of official households depend. The body does not disappear in these documents, but is framed by formulas, seals, and signatures. At the same time, we cannot romanticize the system. The same empire that in one case protects a woman from slander easily blinds rivals, forcibly tonsures politically inconvenient people as monks, and sends entire families to remote fortresses. The same hands that put their seal on the decision to preserve the dowry sign orders for the confiscation of land, for execution for rebellion, for the destruction of icons in monasteries. The law does not abolish violence, but lives alongside it, sometimes softening the blow, sometimes legalizing it. This is the grim realism of Byzantine everyday life. Protecting one woman in a marital dispute does not make the empire just, but it shows how even in a harsh system there are narrow corridors where the text can stand up to the clamor. For the inhabitants of Constantinople, the memory of such cases is enshrined not in thick codes, but in short formulations. Some say that now one must be more careful when using the word indecency in complaints, because the court may turn it against the complainant himself. Some remind their daughters and nieces that they need to watch not only their behavior, but also ensure that the contract is drawn up as accurately as possible. For some, the main conclusion is that real protection comes not from a pious image, but from a well-drafted dowry. For others, it is that without connections in the bureaucracy, any document remains just a piece of paper. In this web of conclusions and retellings, what can be called a confession of the era is formed. It is not spoken aloud in the first person, but speaks through a combination of myths and papers. The myth asserts that the Byzantine court is one of complete debauchery, where a woman's fate depends on whims and whispers. The document responds with references to the article Eclogues to a marriage contract, to a court decision where slander got its name and price. Between them lies a space where real people live, an official, an icon painter, a woman with a dowry, a judge with tired eyes. Each of them makes a choice: to file a complaint, not to back down, to refer to the law, to risk their connections. The outcome is born from the sum of these choices. Ultimately, it is human decisions that determine what will prevail in this case. The icon painter decides to turn the property dispute into a moral denunciation and pays for it. The woman's relatives decide not to wait silently for mercy, but to put forward the contract and demand the application of specific articles. The judge decides to read the case not as an excuse for a show trial against a debauched household, but as a textbook example of the abuse of slander. The empire, accustomed to crippling bodies for rebellion and heresy, this time cripples only the reputation of the informer and leaves the woman's property intact. Thus, another quiet entry appears in her story, indicating that flesh and law in Byzantium could diverge. Rumors and accusations swirled around the houses, but they did not always manage to break through the dry, heavy text of the contract, written under the gaze of imperial law.